right, so we're back, and let's finish up this chapter by talking about reacting to death. Bereavement is the term that we use for that sense of loss that loved ones and family members have following a death. Grief is the powerful sorrow one feels at the death of another. So grief is an emotion. Bereavement is this sense of loss. Mourning is the ceremonies, the behaviors that we have for expressing bereavement after a death. And different cultures have different mourning protocols. Different subsets of a culture can have different mourning rituals and things like that. So how do we react to death? A lot of times when a death occurs, the first thing we want to find out is who's to blame and why'd this happen. It's a really common impulse. And sometimes we'll say, well, why didn't the doctors do more? Or why didn't you try that new experimental drug? Or something like that. Sometimes we'll blame it on the fact that there's a law against that, the law was violated, and it resulted in a death, right? Or why didn't that person stop doing X, that thing that we know is not good, right? Like, why were you still smoking? Why were you still drinking? Why were you still using that illicit drug, whatever? Why did you eat too much? Those kind of, a lot of times we'll blame the victim, the person who's died. If they hadn't done those things, then they wouldn't have died, and I wouldn't be feeling this loss. Sometimes we blame the dead person, right? Sometimes we blame ourselves. Man, I should have really hounded them more about smoking, or I should have stood up more and gotten the doctor to try that thing that I thought might have worked, or whatever. So sometimes they blame themselves. Sometimes it's some kind of distant, faceless other, right? It's like the FDA didn't approve the medication in time, or something like that. Sometimes it's God. Maybe it's somebody so distant that you're like, why would God let this happen? Things like that. It's not necessarily rational. I don't know if I even needed to put not necessarily. It's not probably rational. A lot of times there's no one to blame. There's nothing to blame. Unfortunately, it's part of life. Sometimes there is somebody to blame, but a lot of times there's not, and it's not necessarily rational. When there's a death, a lot of times we want to seek meaning in that death. So here we have a roadside memorial for someone who, dying in a car accident is one of those really just makes us all feel vulnerable kinds of situations. It's such a just complete shame. There's no reason why a person has to die in a car accident. So what do? We try and, when people die, we try and preserve their memories. Like these roadside memorials, we want people to remember. We want people to think about the person who was lost here. Maybe turn to support groups, other people who have lost loved ones in the same kind of way. Maybe join organizations, join the specific group of the Cancer Society that is targeting the type that got your loved one, or Mothers Against Drunk Drivers, or whatever it is. A lot of times we join organizations and we say things like, well, if we can prevent just one other death, it would be worth it. We say things like that. A lot of times, to kind of keep their loved one's memory alive, close family members will start a charity or a scholarship or something like that, so that their loved one lives on. Other things about reacting to death are sometimes our grief is not pure. Sometimes we have something that complicates the grief and makes it go on for longer. Maybe it's absent grief, where a person's just overly private. They don't want to share how they're feeling with other people. And so they skip or they miss out on the customs that the community would normally follow, and they don't get to have that kind of expression with other people. They isolate themselves sometimes, and so they sort of just don't go through the process. And so it sort of lingers longer. There's disenfranchised grief, where there might be some reason why the person can't mourn publicly. A lot of times I think of when you have a person who's committed a crime, And in the commission of that crime, they either killed themselves or were killed during the commission of the crime. The family members of that person who died committing a crime are sort of disenfranchised. They can't really express their mourning because everybody else is mad at their dead loved one for having committed this crime that might have killed other people and things like that. So there are a lot of times where it's, and in this day and age of social media, if a family member of a criminal who killed other people in the process were to mourn, people on social media would start haranguing them and let them know that it is not appropriate for you to be sad for the loss of your loved one who caused the loss of my loved one, right? I mean, you could see both sides, but you can also imagine that the family members don't get to go through any kind of grief process because they should just, be ashamed and not say anything. So disenfranchised grief. Maybe also it could be something like a little less gruesome and dramatic than the example I gave earlier would be, for example, if you have a extramarital affair that's been going on and the cheater dies, the actual spouse can have all the public shows of grief, and then the person who's been, the affair, they're not supposed to really be going through anything because, they were interfering with the marriage anyway. So they have to sort of just grieve privately. Then there's incomplete grief where the body's missing. You don't know what really happened. It's just a mystery, that kind of thing. Maybe missing in action. People who were they just never came home from the war, and you don't even know what happened. They don't have documented proof even that the person died, but they must have. That can cause incomplete grief, where you sort of are mourning their absence, but in the back of your mind kind of hoping that they might really just walk through the door again. So all of these are complicated kinds of grief where a person can really struggle. The key thing is there's no one right way to grieve. There really isn't. I mean, Kubler-Ross telling us we should go through these 5 stages of grief or whatever. There's no one right way to grieve. The good news is for most people, after about a year, they're starting to feel better. No matter what grief strategy or grief circumstance they find themselves in, usually within about a year, people are starting to feel a little bit better. So if we look at this data from 2005, where they followed up with people whose spouse had died, and after a year, 50% of them fell into what's called the resilient category, where within a year, they're sort of back to normal life. About 11% were experiencing normal signs of grief, and 18% were less depressed than they had been a year before, but not fully back to where they had been. 11% were slow to recover. They were mostly doing better, but they were slower. And then about 10% were still in that sort of, I shouldn't say still were in, maybe have slipped into an actual depression. And so most people within about a year are doing decently well. Only about 10% are experiencing depression a year later. So that's a good optimistic thing to leave on. So, okay, well, that wraps up death and dying, and now we have completed the entire lifespan. Thank you guys for listening.